Since I still haven't received all the parts I needed to finish either the Westinghouse or the ever-ready radio with which I was working, or rather on which I was working, I thought, well, maybe you all would enjoy watch me repair a radio in just maybe 2 or 3 episodes, because I took a look at the schematic of this Motorola 5T13P, and I seem to have all the parts. Also, I haven't tested them yet, but I have all the tubes for this radio, and so I think they all function, but I'm going to take out my tube tester in a second and start testing all these tubes and see whether they are indeed all of them functional, because if they aren't, then I'm stranded again. Anyway, I thought you would enjoy having a look at this radio, which is not exactly a portable, but rather a tabletop model. But it had that specific 50s retro look, which I really like. As you can see, it has almost a front like the grille of those 50s Fords and Chryslers and all those cars from the 50s, and I really like it, especially if the buttons are mounted. Then it really looks like the front of those 50s cars, you know, something like this, which is really great. And the knobs are really fat and big. That also seems to be typical for the period, you know, chrome and big fat buttons and wheels and grills. So it's really something that is completely built in the spirit of the 50s. So anyway, I took a look at the schematic, and it's really not that complicated a radio. It has 5 tubes, so I guess some of you would call this an American 5, although it's really tiny little tubes, mini tubes inside, so I don't know if this radio counts for an American 5 radio. Anyway, I took it upon me to start unmounting, or rather disassembling this radio. And the very first thing that I noticed is that if you want to take this radio apart, well, there aren't that many screws. This is the back, which is metal, I think, covered in a sort of a gold tinted cloth to give it a faux finish, you know, something which resembles wood, let's say painted wood or something like that, but it's really nothing more than metal covered in a sort of, well, cloth, I would say. Now, I took a look on all sides of the radio, and the first thing I noticed when I rotated it on its backside is this. As you can see here, it's a model 5T13P. Actually, if you look up the radio, it's called, I think, a Quasar. Why, I wouldn't know, because the word Quasar is never mentioned anywhere on this radio. But okay, I guess they needed a sort of a user-friendly name, and that's why apparently, when you look up this radio, it's not under its model number, but it's called a Motorola Quasar tabletop radio. Now, you can see a little bit of damage here to the casing. This part apparently cracked off, undoubtedly because somebody opened it up, or perhaps because they dropped the radio sometime in the past. But in my opinion, this cracked because somebody opened up the radio and then closed it up again and tightened the screw way too hard. So that's something I'll have to look at, and I'll have to find out how to repair it. Another funny detail of this radio, except its typical 50s look, is this. This little text here which says, I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read it for you. It says, "Do not connect chassis or antenna to water pipe, radiator or other ground." Now, I really wouldn't know why somebody would connect the chassis of this radio to a water pipe or a radiator. I suppose maybe they put this little text here to warn a would-be electrician not to hook it up to ground by hooking it up to water pipe or something like that. I don't know, but it's really weird. I never saw this text on any other radio, and it's funny in a sense. I mean, who would connect up a radio to a water pipe? Anyway, so I took out those two screws here at the bottom, and it turned out that this isn't enough to unmount a radio. So the next thing I did, the most logical thing to do actually, was that I started to unmount or dismount, if you prefer, the buttons by simply pulling them off. Now, the button on the right, let me see, the button on the right, which is, hang on, yeah, I think it's that button, or maybe it's this one. No, okay, so the button on the right, which is this one, which is the tuning button, as you can see, just comes off like that. You could simply pull it off, and in effect the cap, which is mounted on top of the button, comes off at the same time. So you can simply pull this button off. Now, behind the button was hid here a screw, which I undid. Now, I realized that if there was a screw behind this button, then on the other side, at least, there would be another screw there. Or, well, at least I surmised there would be one there. And in effect, this is the volume and on-off button. It turned out that there was not one screw here, but two. And this is mounted solidly onto the casing of the radio. As you can see, there are two holes for the screws. So I undid those two screws, and then I thought, okay, well, that's it, we're done. But like all things in life, it didn't turn out to be that simple. Because, as you can see here, the backside of the radio has slots cut into it. A slot here and a slot over there. And these slots hook into the top part of the radio, which is plastic. It's not Bakelite, it's plastic. It's a little bit chipped, like you see here, but I guess for a radio of 60 years old, it's in rather good condition. And fortunately, it hasn't been painted like the Westinghouse, which I'm still cursing, because I can tell you, to get paint off of plastic is hell. Yeah, so I'm immensely pleased that the previous owner of this radio at least had the good sense not to put paint on the casing. So there you are. I slid open the radio and I started to get a better look at it, and as you can see, it's not a vintage radio old style, which means that the parts are mounted in the air or on small contact posts, but rather on what seems to be a primitive printed circuit board, as you can see down there. There aren't that many parts inside. According to the schematic, there is a combined electrolytic in it, meaning that there is an electrolytic can inside, which houses, I think, 2 or 3 electrolytic capacitors, and you can see it there, that can. Alright, so the problem is now that I need to unhook this radio, or rather I need to unhook the speaker, I think, if I want to get it out of here. But give me just a second and I'll be back with another update to show you how I finally managed to open up this radio. So there you go. I finally managed to get the chassis of the radio out of the out of its cabinet. Now it turns out that the reason why it was initially so difficult to pull it out is because this chassis is connected to the AC with a safety connector device. As you can see down there in the cabinet, there is a safety connector which connects up to the PCB with those 2 little metal pins you can see down at the bottom, those 2. So in effect, for the radio to be functional, you need to slide the chassis into the safety connector at the back of the radio. I guess they did that for safety reasons. So yeah, I'll have to take that into account when I work on the radio. Okay, first things or things that are clear at first is this: one of the wires of the speaker let go. As you can see, the wire simply broke off, if it was connected at all, but I don't see any solder on it, so I'm beginning to suspect that this wire was simply not attached to the speaker. The speaker itself looks in fine shape. And here is paper explaining the position of and the type of tubes used in the radio. There is a 12 BE6. I don't know yet which type of tube that is. I'll have a look in a moment. There's a 2 hang on, a 12BA6, so a 12BE6, a 12BA6, a 12AV6, a 5005, whatever that is, and a 35W. As I was saying before the battery of my camera ran out, is that the whole chassis was attached to the back of the cabinet by these two pins, which go into a safety connector, and this, I guess, ground wire, which was attached to the back, which is metal, by the way, of the radio. So once I undid this ground wire and I unplugged it from the safety jack, I could simply slit it out. Now, taking a closer look at the inside of the radio shows me that, as I said before, the wire, one of the wires of the speaker, was loose. Whether it is the solder that gave out, or the wire that broke, or because it simply was never wired properly, I don't know. Now, according to the schematic of the radio, there are a few electrolytics in this radio, and namely 3 electrolytics, 2 of 40 microfarads and 1 of 30, and all 3 of them are inside this one can, so that will probably need replacing. Also, the chassis is dirty. There's all sorts of dust on it, the usual crud, but aside from that, I don't see any damage, any obvious damage to the radio. I don't immediately see any parts that have been replaced, although I see a number which has been written on top of the electrolytic. So I suspect the electrolytic at one time or other must have been, well, serviced, replaced, I suppose. Also, one of the wires that go to the coil, the antenna coil, has been twisted together and soldered up. I don't know why they did that, but in my opinion, that has been done because somebody who opened this radio, or maybe wanted to service this radio, pulled a little bit too hard on the case and tore the wire apart, which he repaired by simply twisting and soldering the two parts together again. Not a very clean way of repairing it, but I guess it'll do. The antenna coil, as you can see, is mounted on top of the speaker and is held into the casing by a sort of a cardboard sleeve, which has been stapled together and then clamped above the speaker. The speaker itself looks okay, but it is held in place by these metal tacks which you see here. In fact, one of the tacks is missing. I suppose the person who serviced the radio or opened it up tried to pull off one of the tacks, wasn't probably very successful, and then never bothered putting it back. So the speaker is attached by 3 more of these. And they will be a little bit of a pain to get off. But we'll see whether I need to do that, because if the speaker works satisfactorily, then I don't even need to unmount the speaker and it can stay where it is. Maybe in time I'll find one of these and put it here where it's missing. Alright, so now when I look at the underside of this rather primitive PCB, you can see that it's not very clean, and it's covered in a sort of a red lacquer, which I suppose they put on top to protect the PCB, but I'll need to clean it off, because this lacquer is going to be a real pain. I can see that immediately. Also, you can see here in the upper right corner a small copyright notice which says copyright 1958, 1956. Difficult to see, but I guess it's 1956. So although this is not immediately an indication of the production date of this radio, it must have been built after 1956. Great. Also, there is a very weird little wire mounted here on the radio, and I have no clue what this wire is doing. It's a very peculiar wire, and I need to find out what its function is. Well, at first glance it doesn't have any function at all, and I think it was part of the PCB board and it was mounted like this, and then at one stage or other it must have started to peel off. So probably I will end up cutting it away, because it's way too dangerous to leave it floating like this. It might create a short circuit. All the other parts are, I would tend to say, rather conventional. There are a few ceramic capacitors, as you can see, a small IF coil, which is here, then a few IF cans, which are here, and of course the sockets for the tubes, which you can see. There are 5 of them. And then the rest are simply carbon type resistors with 1 watt resistor here, and then all the others, I think, half a watt. There aren't too many parts on this board, so I think refurbishing and rewiring this, or rather repairing this chassis, will take, in comparison to the other chassis with which I'm busy right now, the Westinghouse and the Everready, this one is really rather simple. So I think I'm going to try to repair it in maybe 1 or 2 installments. The on-off switch, or rather the volume button, it feels rough. I think it's not working very well, and the on-off switch doesn't work in either direction. So I tried to switch it on and off, but it doesn't react, it doesn't click. So that might be broken. So I might have to have a look at the internals of the switch. So there you go. Excuse me. I'm a little bit ill still. So unfortunately, once in a while you will have to bear with my coughing. So before I really start to dig into this radio in this and start repairing, or rather changing the parts on the chassis, I'm going to clean it all up a little bit so that I have a better view of all the parts, and I'm going to test all the tubes of the radio. The tip of the day is this. In case you are wondering where I keep all the parts of all the radios that I repair, or all the devices I repair, I use these. I use plastic zip bags, which they use to put food into the freezer. Now you can buy 25 of these for a little bit more than or less than $2. So they are not very expensive, and they are quite practical. One bag like this can hold about a liter of stuff, you know, and you can write on it with an alcohol pen. So as you can see, all the parts which I unmount or dismount from a radio, I put into a bag like this. If there are many parts, then I will use 2 or 3 of these bags to keep all the parts separated. But in any case, so that's the trick I use to keep all the parts in one spot, so as not to lose any of them. So there you go. Give me a little time to clean this all up and to give a second diagnostic of the radio, and then we'll start digging right in. So hang in tight, stay tuned, and I'll be back quite soon with another update. Thank you. Bye bye.